Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we will explore tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act and discuss the implications for environmental justice. I'm joined today by Sylvia Chi, Senior Policy Analyst here at Just Solutions. Welcome, Sylvia, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Hi, Aiko. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you on the show with me, Sylvia, and it's such a pleasure to work with you at Just Solutions. It's been great to see what you're accomplishing, the analytical information you're providing, engaging partners to shape federal decisions, and raising important solutions to ensure tax credits benefit disadvantaged communities. You've worked on so many important issues, but you started your career in the private sector. What made you want to make a switch and work on environmental justice issues?
I've always wanted to work on this side. I think it was just I had the good timing of graduating from law school into a major recession. So the only job I was able to find was within the private sector.
I think that's the case for a lot of people, isn't it? When you graduate from school, you kind of take the job that you can, and it's always a chance to learn a lot and then finally be able to do the work that you want to do. It's just great to have you working on these issues as an advocate and making great progress. Today, we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act's tax credits. Passed in 2022, IRA is one of the most significant actions the federal government has taken on clean energy and climate change. Tax credits are a significant aspect of the IRA and will account for the majority of the bill's spending commitments to communities and individuals. What is the objective of these tax credits? I mean, when you look at the statute, what are we ultimately trying to accomplish through this vehicle of tax credits?
The general idea is for tax credits to function as a subsidy and make cleaner energy cheaper. So it's actually a pretty broad application. The tax credits go towards everything from solar energy to nuclear energy to manufacturing components in various electrical equipment. And the general idea is just subsidizing these technologies so that it's cheaper and easier for the market to shift away from the fossil fuel-based economy that we have today.
Can you give us an idea of the amount of tax credits in the IRA?
It is the majority of the spending in the bill, and at the time it's passed, it was the official estimate from the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation was that it would be $271 billion over 10 years. And since then, it's been reported that JCT has revised that estimate substantially upward. And then there's been many different independent estimates from both nonprofit and private sector sources that have all been much higher than 271 billion. And the biggest estimate I've seen is from Goldman Sachs, which put it at 1.2 trillion.
That's really significant. And who stands to benefit?
Well, so it's pretty broad and it will probably be pretty geographically diverse, but over 86% of the credits are for commercial use. So historically, that would be mostly corporations that use them. And because the tax credits range in covering a whole bunch of different kinds of applications, it will be everything from commercial vehicle fleets to solar panels to nuclear power plants. So we'll probably see it deployed all over the country, but mostly in the context of companies taking advantage of them.
And so as it relates to our interest around environmental justice, can you share the way in which the policy will or should benefit disadvantaged communities or benefit individuals with lower incomes?
It doesn't provide a very direct way to benefit low-income communities and environmental justice communities, at least not directly, with one exception. The main exception is the Low-Income Communities Bonus Credit Program, which is a program that needs a better name. But basically, it would add 10% or 20% credit adders to an existing credit if you develop a project that is cited in a low-income community or benefits a low-income community. And there's a lot of specific rules about what that means. But basically, the idea is they're trying to incentivize the creation of community solar in environmental justice communities, or putting solar and storage in affordable housing in energy justice communities or environmental justice communities. This is a totally new program. The US has never done anything like this before. So there's a lot of potential there. At the same time, it's also limited to 1.8 gigawatts of capacity every year, which, if you compare that to the average size of a community solar program, that means you're going to get about 360 projects every year, which is not a ton, but definitely, a significant increase from what we're seeing nowadays. And also that's a very rough estimate. The program will also be used to install small solar and wind single-family homes and multi-family housing as well.
And so when you talk about 360 projects a year, that is across the US?
That's right.
And it can range from an individual to a community project.
Yeah, there are a few different categories within that program, but it encompasses single-family homes in low-income communities, as well as multifamily affordable housing or community solar programs.
Any other things that sort of help to ensure that this is actually going to happen, that the investments that we want to see are more likely to happen, other than the incentive of the bonus?
There are additional incentives for many of the tax credits to encourage developers to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So there are some incentives to improve labor standards in these projects. There's also domestic content bonus requirements to try to encourage, this onshoring of industrialization in the US, or reshoring, as some people say. There's also a 10% bonus for some of the credits for siting facilities in energy communities. And that is meant to try to address this energy transition where some communities are going to be particularly hard hit economically if they have a coal mine or a refinery in their community that provides a lot of jobs and a lot of local tax base. So the idea is that they're trying to incentivize developing clean energy or other parts of the clean energy economy in those particular places that would be especially hard hit if the fossil fuel industry pulls out.
Interesting. I appreciate so much, Sylvia, the work that you do to make these topics so accessible and understandable. And we're doing this podcast where we're talking about both tax policy, which is complicated, and we're also talking about energy policy and gigawatts, which is also complicated. And so I wanted to layer in this question about Justice 40. And part of what the hope is in that is to ensure that 40% of the benefits are for disadvantaged communities. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about the reason why and the legal reasons why, or the conversation why Justice 40 does not apply to this policy and this program, or these programs. I guess it's more than one program.
So Justice 40 is, first of all, Justice 40 is a goal. It's not a requirement. And the decision of which programs are covered by Justice 40 is made by the White House. And so they've decided that the tax credits are not going to be covered. I think there is a strong argument to be made that they could qualify and be covered as Justice 40, but I believe the administration's position is that they don't have the legal authority to condition the tax credits on any requirements that would advance Justice 40, and that's partly because the tax credits are non-competitive. So that means basically any taxpayer, like a corporation, can claim the credit on their return, and it's not a matter of the corporation filling out an application and getting an approval from the government. So because it's somewhat self-executing for most, but not all of these credits. So I believe that's why the administration thinks they don't have the authority to put any extra requirements that would work for Justice 40. But considering that in many other Justice 40 covered programs, agencies are saying this is a Justice 40 covered program, and then the only way that they are advancing Justice 40 is suggesting or encouraging recipients to comply with it, I'm not sure why they can't do the same in the case of tax credits.
So, Sylvia, when we look at the corporations that are taking advantage of the tax credit, it's not like it's in the future, it's actually happening right now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do we have a sense of what type of corporation is going to take advantage of this tax credit and where they might be located and the types of things they're doing?
We don't have a great sense of that at this point because most of the tax credits, they're going to be claimed by corporations when they file their taxes, which is probably at the end of the year. Also, there's just not a lot of disclosure requirements. And so it's going to be difficult to have that level of granularity in the oversight of the tax credits. We'll get some aggregate numbers. We'll definitely understand on a nationwide basis how much is the country spending in tax expenditures for these credits, but it'll be harder to understand which companies specifically are using them and for which specific projects.
You laid out that those tax credits can be used for a myriad of energy sources. And many of those we would say are not clean energy. We've had a podcast around nuclear energy with Arjun Makajani, one of our first podcasts, and talked at length about that and why that is not a environmental justice energy solution. When we look at all those options, some are problematic, some questionable, and others we think are good. Do you think that we're going to see the investments we want for wind and solar and solutions that advance a just transition to clean energy?
I think there's definitely a lot of pickup from industry to take advantage of the tax credits for wind and solar and battery storage, but it's important to keep in mind that this whole suite of tax credits also directs a lot of subsidies towards nuclear, as well as for the hydrogen production and CCS, as well as some other problematic polluting energy sources. So, for example, the one that I'm most unhappy with is the extension of the production tax credit for incinerators for electricity generation. So that's just an incredibly polluting and unhealthy source of electricity that is the federal government is paying these companies that burn trash, often in the middle of cities and environmental justice communities, to create electricity.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that we would consider trash incineration as a clean energy source, one that we would want to incentivize as taxpayers. And so how do we reconcile that? I mean, how do we recognize the amount of money, the scale that you started out the podcast talking about? It's a lot of money moving around, a lot of investment that we're making, and the chance in which that money can make it into energy companies, energy systems that really are not clean in terms of the perspective of environmental justice communities and environmental justice advocates. So what is our response to that? I mean, what is the strategy for the people who are listening who are community advocates? I mean, what are the avenues through which they could help to influence, or are there avenues through which they could influence who is able to take advantage of the tax credits?
Yeah, there are a few possibilities. Some of the tax credits are still going through or about to go through rulemaking. So there's the opportunity to engage with Treasury and the IRS about how they make the rules for what qualifies, for example, for clean hydrogen production. There's this credit 45V, the hydrogen production tax credit, that is supposed to be for clean hydrogen. And so Treasury is going to have to set the rules for what counts as clean hydrogen. I think it'll be really important for advocates to engage in that and make sure that's as strong of a rule as possible. Likewise, for CCS, there are a lot of ways that can go wrong. So there's a lot of need for strong rules and oversight for that credit as well. For some of the other credits where there's not a rulemaking or the rulemaking has already happened, it's really probably more of a political question at the federal level for the future when Congress wants to revisit this, and they will. They're planning to take up tax reform in a few years. So I think it'll be important to start building that political pressure and campaigns to talk to their members of Congress about their concerns about, we have this incinerator in our neighborhood that's making us unhealthy. We would like to stop directing our taxpayer dollars towards that.
I'm not an expert on the pollution side of this conversation, but doesn't burning garbage contribute to climate change?
I think it does. I think the argument is probably that it contributes to climate change less than other kinds of combustion, but it's definitely not a zero emission power source.
Yeah. From our perspective, it's not clear that we are thinking about these energy sources comprehensively, right? In the case of nuclear, and the podcast that we had with Dr. Makajani was the recognition that the storage of nuclear waste, the mining for uranium contributes to pollution, damage of the planet. Also, our podcast around carbon capture, use and storage, same, where are we putting all the carbon that we're capturing? So it's interesting for us to recognize that we aren't really taking the approach that we would have, which is there are other sources of energy, albeit none of them being absolutely pure, but that when you look at how they function and how they are created holistically, there are clear winners that are better at protecting the planet and protecting communities at the same time. So it's interesting that we seem to have that short sight that I think is questionable whether or not we're going to ultimately reach our goals. And unfortunately, it's communities that we work with that are going to be hurt the most because of that short-sightedness. So let's pivot to the individuals. So the tax credits for individuals. For people who are listening, who are thinking about facilitating clean energy, what are things that they should know about the tax credits?
So the first thing that people should know when they're thinking about these tax credits on an individual basis is they need to be able to take advantage of tax credits, which means they have to have sufficient tax liability. And I think the number is about 4 in 10 American households don't qualify. They don't have enough taxable income to use any tax credits, and these are not refundable tax credits. So you need to pay enough in taxes to the federal government that you would be able to apply the credits to. I think it's important to just set the baseline for what a tax credit is, and this applies to both individuals and corporations. A tax credit is kind of like a gift card that you can only spend on your tax bill. So it's not refundable. If you're not buying anything with it, you don't have any taxes, it's not like the government's going to pay you that amount of the gift card back. So that means you just can't use the tax credit. So that's about 40% of households can't use it at all. Much of the tax credits for individuals are for residential investments. That also cuts out most renters. And I think the percentage of renter households varies geographically, but it's also quite high. I can't remember the number right now. But because a lot of these investments are for example, putting solar on your rooftop or changing your windows to more energy efficient windows, those are things that as a renter you almost always cannot do unless the landlord wants to do it, in which case the landlord usually is the one who takes the tax credit. The problem is that most of the time landlords aren't incentivized to make those investments. So that's what they call the split incentive paradox, and is a big problem in energy efficiency policy generally.
It seems interesting that on the corporate tax side, there's a recognition, additional resources if you are investing in or benefiting low-income communities, but on the individual side, don't have any of that. And I think it's unfortunate that there aren't incentives for landlords, to make those investments, which ultimately makes people's energy bills go down. So low-income people save money, and then some way in which this tax approach could benefit people who have low wages and don't owe any taxes. So for us to make that change would require a legislative change. And do you see that there's a recognition that we've left out a lot of people and that we need to do something to make sure this is an inclusive effort?
I haven't heard a lot from members of Congress that they're concerned about this problem, but it's also just generally difficult to get anything passed through Congress. So we'll see what happens.
And so for people who are eligible, so you need to owe taxes, so you need to make a good amount of money. Are there things that they should know specifically about taking advantage? What are some examples of the things that people could be buying to take advantage of the tax credit?
The big ones for homeowners are probably going to be things like solar and storage, as well as some of the appliances that drive a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions from homes. So lots of people are talking about heat pumps. For folks who have that tax liability and own their homes, I think heat pumps are great. It's a way to get rid of your gas furnace and also be able to both heat and cool your home in a really efficient way.
Can community organizations, especially those that are located in disadvantaged communities, what are ways that they could take advantage of this tax credit, or can they take advantage of it?
Yeah, one thing that's really a really significant change in the tax credits that were in the IRA is this new provision called direct pay, also called elective pay, but it's a mechanism for entities that don't have tax liability to take advantage of the tax credits. So that means local governments, states, nonprofits, all of these entities don't usually pay federal income tax. So in the past, they couldn't use tax credits directly. If they wanted to, they would have to partner with various middlemen and like equity partners to take advantage of it, which is less efficient. But now through direct pay, they will be able to receive the credit amount as a payment from the federal government. So that means that community-based organizations, nonprofits that are in environmental justice communities or work with environmental justice communities can now use these credits to make investments cheaper. So that can be developing their own community solar projects, developing their own community resilience hubs, things like that.
Given that many corporations pay little or no taxes, then are eligible for significant tax credit, makes me wonder about this strategy broadly. People with lower incomes, on the other hand, who pay taxes, many are not eligible for federal tax benefits under IRA. So when you look at the tax policy, it's really imbalanced.
It's important to keep in mind that this type of tax credit policy is probably not the optimal, ideal way to advance the kind of clean energy policies that we really need to see, especially from an environmental justice and climate justice perspective. But it is, in fact, what is available due to the political conditions. And so if I were Queen of the United States, this is not what I would develop at all. But since this is what we were able to get through Congress and under very challenging conditions, we're just trying to do the best we can with what Congress gave us and try to make the best implementation of that as we can.
I mean, I think we can safely say that EJ communities were not as involved in the creation of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think had communities been more involved, we could have created better policy. And perhaps the political dynamic or political realities wouldn't have allowed for that. But I think that's a good point, which is both the ability to build good policy, especially policy that impacts people with lower incomes, is important to have people who are experts on how to get benefits to communities with lower incomes. And then what work is happening to be able to influence that political dynamic to be more conducive to supporting working families who are out there every day, who are part of our economy, part of our tax system, to make sure that they had some benefit from this as well. But I think your point more broadly, which is tax credits is one policy approach and is not the one that we would have moved forward in this way. this has been an interesting conversation to understand how tax policy could exacerbate or at a minimum reinforce the current economic dynamics that we have, and how this could have been and should be an opportunity in which we are facilitating a progressive change in tax policy. And we have not accomplished that through this historic and significant investment. As everyone transitions onto clean energy, the dirty energy will be left to people with lower incomes, and subsequently the cost of that energy will go up. So I think for me, what I'm seeing is that we have just made this investment and set up communities not only to be more financially insecure and unable to be included, but potentially setting up their communities to be even more polluted by incentivizing polluting energy sources. So when you talked a little bit about cities and states taking advantage, it made me think about, are there ways in which states or cities could be complementing this or supplementing this federal tax credit?
States can pass complementary tax policy to stack onto the federal tax credits and increase the total amount of credits that go to certain projects. They can also pass tax policy that incentivizes complementary investments that are needed, for example, in like grid investments, or pass their own individual tax credits so that more individuals can take advantage of the incentives for clean energy at the household level. And we see that all the time in other types of tax policy, like there has been a federal child tax credit. There's also state child tax credits. So I think it would be great for states to do similar things on energy efficiency and electrification investments on the household level as well. And then there's also, just because of this direct pay mechanism in the IRA, it would be amazing to see school districts and cities and public housing authorities deploying solar and storage on their facilities and transitioning their fleets of vehicles to clean vehicles. These are all things that are incentivized by the federal tax credits.
Lots of great ideas. I think that when you talked, Sylvia, about schools, public housing, government buildings, and social services, many of those are located in disadvantaged low-income communities. And I think to the extent that we can be bringing those resources for kids to have clean and heated and cooled schools, and the ability to which people could live in public housing, taxpayer-funded housing, to be able to give them the access to cleaner energy, cleaner environments, and more affordability makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks, Sylvia, for being on the show. We ask all of our guests this final question, which is, what makes you hopeful about the environmental justice movement today?
I know it sounds cheesy, but like the young people, I'm no longer young, but I think there's so many young people out there who are getting really passionate and committed to environmental justice and climate justice, and that's very inspiring to see. And it makes me hope. It makes me think that like change is really possible.
Can't agree with you more. Thank you, Sylvia, for being with us today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. If you like this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest episodes. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.